Well, hello, my name is Earl Beede, and I'm here with the Software Effectiveness Conference here at Construx. And I'm here to talk about a subject I find super exciting. The idea of using the user story format from the very high level requirements, the top of my stack, all the way down to the bottom of my stack. And how does that kind of look and what's going on in there? And so trying to see what I can use this user story format for throughout my requirements decisions. So that's what I'll be focusing on for the next 45 minutes or so. While I'm presenting this, over on the side over there, you can see a chat box. Here's where you can ask questions, make some comments, get something and you give me some feedback, and I'll be looking at those at the end of the session here. And so I'll be answering your questions at that point. So we'll go through the material, put your questions up there, just queue them on up, and then at the end, we'll answer any outstanding questions that are up there. So let's look at user stories from top to bottom. But before I do that, I want to sort of say, what are some basic, I wanted to give some basic things about what are my basic requirements are and what our user stories are, because to make sure that we're on the same page in this conversation, because these words have a lot of meanings in organizations. Some people mean slightly different things with them, and I really like to make sure we're on the same page here. So then after I gotten those two things settled, which shouldn't take that much time, then we'll look at 3 levels of user story. Our top level user stories, the middle user stories, and that's where we're going to see the most work here. And then what do they look like at the bottom? How does the user story thing work at the bottom? And then I'll wrap it all up and refresh what we just talked about. So that's what I'm going to be doing here. So let's take a look at some basic user requirements. What do my basic requirements look like? And so here's a little primer. When you think about requirements, you really need to think about people trying to do something, people trying to achieve something, and they're using your product, the thing that you're building, whether it's a whole product or just a component, they're using the thing that you're building to try to solve what they want to do. For example, let's say we have a young woman here, and the young woman wants to go somewhere. In fact, she says, I want to go to work. And that's a fine thing. She has something she wants to accomplish. She has a need, right? And this is what we mean by user need. She has a need. She needs to get to work, a user need. But she's not the only person on the planet, right? There's a young man, and the young man, he wants to go someplace too. And he needs to get to a game of some kind. He needs to get to the game, right? Both have needs to go somewhere. They need transport. They want to go somewhere. What is your project going to solve? Is it going to solve for the girl, or is it going to solve for the young man? And this is where requirements come in. Requirements is making a decision about which one of these we're going to solve for. And we can then look at a couple different products. We can look at a really nice vehicle, or we can look at kind of a small little economy vehicle here and say which one of these are going to best solve the problem for I need to get to work or I need to get to the game. And maybe they both equally solve it. And so now it's about secondary considerations, like how much do I want to spend? How much fuel economy does it get? How easy is it to park? There might be secondary concerns. And that's how we sort of go from top, I just need to get somewhere, to middle, when I get there, I want to do it at this cost level. I want to do it at this thing, and maybe all the way down to the bottom. But the one difference I want to make here and sort of be kind of clear about is that if we look at this, requirements, I like to think requirements are just about decisions about what problem we're going to solve, right? That's when they're really, really powerful. And that's where user stories really get a punch here. Because user stories are going to say, let me describe the problems that we need to solve. And of course, we're going to have decisions about how to solve them too, whether we should go with a big fancy car or a small car. And some people like to call these decisions about how we're going to solve them requirements, because they're decisions that we're making. And I hear that a lot. But technically, I just want to be very clear here, when I'm thinking about user stories top to bottom, I'm thinking about decisions about what problem we're going to solve and how we analyze that problem going forward, rather than decisions about how we're going to solve them, which for me is closer to design. So that's what requirements kind of look like here. Because now I can start seeing my entire process as a series of decisions. Right? As we were here with the cars, the decision about problem to solve, and I have that in green here, and decisions about how to solve them in blue, we can see our project as this series of decisions, right? Decisions about what problems to solve and decisions about how to solve them. And this is a 4-level decision tree. You could have different levels if you so chose. But in this 4 levels here, at my top level, the product level here, at the product level, this kind of decision is really about why are we even making this? Who's it for? Who are we trying to make happy? One of the great sayings I've always heard in product management is that for any given thing that you're going to do, something you're going to do, like take people to the transport people, you can make one customer really happy, the rest you try not to make upset. And so what decisions about who we're going to make happy here and what technologies, how we're going to solve it, are we going to bring to solve that? All right. I want to tap here. So that's the product level. At the project level, we're deciding about how we're going to move that product forward in a short period of time. You might use the word release at this level, right? So a release or a milestone, but there's some movement of that product in a shorter period of time that takes it to a new state, right? For some of you doing this very rapidly, it might be a couple of weeks. You might say a weekly release. So whatever you're using to move that forward in a short period of time, that's what I sort of mean by project. What's its purpose? How's it going to move that product forward in a short period of time? And to do that, you're probably going to add some capabilities, some features. And when we look at features, we have decisions again about how we're going to solve that, workflow analysis, task analysis, and how we're actually going to design that. And down at the very bottom, we're all the way down to preferences. And so I'll probably be looking at these two as sort of my middle level, up here, sort of my top, and down here sort of to my bottom level. And my 3 levels, I want to go from top to bottom today. And to do that, I want to slice this a little bit differently to give you a slightly different look at this particular problem, right? And this is how I want to slice it. I want to slice it from these kind of decisions we have to make. And again, I've got the green, which I think are decisions about what kind of problem we're going to solve. And I've got the blue about how we're going to solve them. And so if you think about this, this is sort of a strategy about how we want to do this. And I could draw a line right through there and say, hey, these decisions on the top, these are decisions that business people are pretty good at making, right? They're saying, yeah, I can make those kinds of decisions. And decisions down here at the bottom, these are kind that tech people are pretty good at making, right? They can say, yeah, I know how to make those kinds of decisions. And so we can then figure out how we want to get through all these decisions we need to make and what kind of path we need to make to take them. In traditional requirements techniques, what we try to do was try to make all the top decisions, then make all the bottom decisions. Turns out that doesn't work very well. User stories and the Agile approach really wants to make decisions sort of sliced up like that, right? A decision saying, well, business will make the top level decision, and then the tech will make the bottom level decision, and we'll put that in one thing. And we'll see how we might want to package that in a little bit. So that's what requirements decisions. We have all these decisions that we need to make. And what's really cool is these decisions always have 2 key parts to this decision. There's 2 key things you need to make clear about to start to say we've made a good requirements decision. For a good requirements decision, you really need to talk about the thing that's actually happening, the epic or the function that they're doing, right? This is the thing that they need to do. I need to get to the game. I need to get to work. I need to be able to know the patient's status. I need to be able to see this information. What is it that they need to do that they're hiring your product to do? That's part of the decision. And you have to decide, do we want to solve that problem, right? Because there are problems out there that we don't want to solve. Do I really want to solve that particular problem? So you got to decide the function, and you have to also decide when I do that function, what makes that function acceptable, right? So let's think about this. Think about going to the game. Now, when you're going to a crowded place, you may worry about, well, I need to find a place to park. That's sort of a sub-function here, but so my vehicle needs to be easy to park. Get me to the game, but easy to park makes it acceptable. Or getting the game can take all my friends. That's what makes getting the game acceptable. Or getting the game, I don't have to worry about it being stolen. That's what makes it acceptable. So all those things, the same getting the game, but different things that make getting there acceptable, right? A certain amount of safety, performance, usability, ease of use, all that kind of stuff. So you need 2 key parts to make this really happen. So that is what I'm thinking about when I think about a requirement. I'm thinking about a requirement as a decision that can be decided at multiple different levels of decisions going on. And each of these decisions has these 2 key parts, the function and what makes that function acceptable. So how does that help us think about a user story? Now, a lot of you are probably very familiar with user stories, so this is, again, a quick refresher here. What do we mean by user story? And when I think of a user story, I always like to think about a physical card, because that helps me remind myself that the story is bigger than the user story description. A user story needs to have a front and a back, because that's what a card has. A card has a front part and a back part. And so when I think about a front part and back part, it reminds me of all the stuff going on here to help me capture a complete decision. So let's take a look about the front and back of this card. So here's the front of a card, and here's what's typically on the front of a card as part of this good decision. There is a name up here. We see the verb noun format name here. The verb format name here is really about a shorthand to make sure I'm talking about something that somebody wants to do. If I'm finding it hard to get a verb here, I probably don't have a user story. I probably have some component or something I'm building. It's not saying something that somebody wants to do. So I want to see that verb noun format. And then I have a textual description. It's kind of interesting. The textual description was basically initially a free-form text field. Describe briefly what that user is trying to do. Unfortunately, a lot of people, when they first started making these decisions, found it was much easier to talk about what the system does, not what the user wants to do. So instead of saying, oh, as a manager, I need certain information in this fashion so that I can make a decision. Instead, they would write, as a manager, I want a report. Nobody wants a report. Everyone needs information in order to get something done. And so we were talking about the solutions in here. And so some bright people in mid-2005 said, you know what? I think I have an idea for this. What I'm going to do is we're going to create a little mini template here, right? And in this mini template, I'm going to say, as a blank, I can blank. And what they were trying to put in here, they were trying to put in who was the consumer and what they needed to do, what function they wanted to do with the product. Remember, trying to go back to talk about what problems do we want to solve? Who is that consumer among all the consumers? Let's be as specific as possible. And what are they trying to do? So as a manager, I need to make a decision based upon certain information. Or as a ultrasound tech specialist, I need to be able to determine what is air and what is actually nerve. Or as a, what's another product I've been working on lately? As a oil explorer, I need to identify the level and depth of the rock and what type of rock it is. So there's lots of things that people need to do, problems they want to solve. What's really cool is that if you do this relatively well, you're going to see that, wow, that seems pretty obvious. Because mostly the front of the card should be pretty obvious. It should be like, well, that's what needs to be done. Unfortunately, with this little template that they had, people were still putting in solutions. As a manager, I can't have a report, or I need a report. It's like, no. So they said, you know what, let's put another field on here. Let's put a so that field on here. And the so that field was there to say, okay, why do you want a report? Well, I need a report because I need to make a decision. Well, that's what I'm looking for here. That's the ticket. The so that field right here, that field is optional. If you really understood the problem, you don't need a so that field. But the so that field is sort of the why question. Well, why do you want that? So drive us back up here. But you notice that the front of the card here is doing a really good job at helping us capture our function, what we need to do. Not how we're going to do it, but what we need to do when we build our thing. And then also on the front of the card, there's typically some sort of estimate going on here too. And the way we estimate could be start off with t-shirt sizes, and it gets small enough, we'll switch to story points or something like that. So that's the front of the card. But this is just the front. On the front, we have the name and the description. A user story is not the description. That's just the front of the old user story. We also have the back of the card. On the back of the card, we see a couple key fields typically seen here as well. We got some notes, and this is where I like to put, if I do have a solution in mind, this is a great place to put it, right? It's like, let's do it this way. Because as a note now, I'm not telling the team it's required, it's just one idea. And if you come up with a better, cheaper, faster idea, let's hear it, because it's just my idea, right? So let's put some solution ideas in there. But more importantly in the back is we have the acceptance criteria. The acceptance criteria says when I do this thing, what we were doing before here was trying to enter a defect. When I try to enter a defect, I got to get 98% correct on the very first attempt. That means if I'm entering it, this is a correct solution. You've made it easy for me to enter it, right? And hard for me to screw up because I'm getting 98% correct on the very first attempt. So that's a big win right there. The other big win here is like, gosh, it takes me very little time to do this, right? 2 minutes or less, or maybe you want to be more aggressive, minute or less, 30 seconds or less, right? You have to decide how aggressive I really want to be to make it acceptable to enter a defect. And I don't want to spend a lot of time learning how to do this. All these says when I enter a defect, this means it's acceptable for me to enter that defect. And that's the key thing on the back of the card. And the front and the back together here make my complete user story. Almost. There's one more piece missing here. All this captures the little statement of what a requirement might be. But around that is a bunch of context. That is never captured on either the front nor the back. The front and the back do not capture the context. All that has to be captured by the human being. And in Scrum, that's the product owner. The product owner has to say, hey, this is where this is going on. This is where it's being used. This is what the people like that are using it. All that context has to be carried in a conversation with the team every time they touch this card. So a complete requirement, this captures enough of the decision to remind us to have a conversation about the context. It is never enough all by itself. So when we go to use these from top to bottom, we have to remember not only is this just a placeholder for a conversation, but it's about a decision, and we need to have that conversation to round it entirely out. So let's start to look how we can use these from top to bottom. So what do my top user stories actually look like? Well, let's think about what we're trying to decide here, right? What kind of decision do we need to make? And if we think about problem decisions at the top, we're talking about why do people even want to use this? What are we bringing to the table that they're going to give us their time, attention, or money in response of, so they say, yes, I choose your product over everything else to solve my particular problem. What problem is that they need to have solved? That's the top level decision. And we can use the user story format to go after that. Because remember, that captures the decision, both the function and the acceptance, what makes that function acceptable. So let's take a look at this. So for a product vision, I need to do three key things here. I need to select a consumer. I need to decide out of all the people who have problems like this, which set am I going to solve? Now, the danger here is a lot of people want to walk in here and say, hey, let's solve this for everyone. Let's make everybody happy. And unfortunately, when you try to make everybody happy, you tend to get mush. You get something that makes nobody happy. Very few people have it. They're like, it's okay. But if something exciting comes along that really solved my needs better because they focused on me, then I would pick that. But generally, you get something mushy. I like to joke, Windows 8, right? Windows 8 was kind of a mushy sort of OS, whereas Windows 10, because Windows 8, they were trying to make both the desktop and the tablet people happy. And I think in Windows 10, they said, you know what? We're not going to try to piss off the tablet people, but if there's a conflict between desktop and tablet, we're going to lean desktop. Right? So that's the idea, is accepting consumer. It doesn't mean that you do only things for them, but it says when there's a conflict, who wins? Who are we making this for? Who are making sure that we're making their needs? And then for that consumer, we're going to look at the functions that we want to solve for that consumer. For my manager, it might be some sort of information gathering and presenting stuff. For my ultrasound technician, it might be about how to gather an image and save an image. For my explorer of oil and gas reserves, it might be how to identify deep layers of rock and rock formations, right? What is it that they're trying to do that I'm going to create a product to help solve that for? And when I do it for that particular consumer, how do I make sure it's acceptable? How do I make sure it's something that they can actually do? And say, yep, that solved my problem in a way that doesn't really make me really upset and hate this product altogether. So I need those three things in a product vision. And so how I'm going to solve that? First, I'm going to say, I can use my user story format to go out and select my customer and say among that set, who's it going to be? Then I can find my function. Remember, I can capture that in the user story description. So I'm going to say as a top level, I can, epic, and then I'm going to flip the card over, at least metaphorically in my head if I'm using a tool, and come back and say, yep, here's how well it has to work, how reliable it needs to be, how usable it has to be. And now here's another danger point. Sometimes you say, well, how safe does it have to be? They go, it has to be totally safe. Well, okay, how usable does it need to be? Oh, it needs to be completely usable. And how reliable? Oh, it needs to be totally reliable. They want massive amounts of everything. And unfortunately, that's not really possible. In fact, that's what my little graph on the page is showing right here, is that some things just don't get along with other things, right? Right now, usability and security are not the best friends. The more usable I make it, the typically less secure it becomes. The more secure I make it, the more frustrating it is to actually use. And we're making strides to try to bring these two together, but they're still not very good friends. Reliability and performance tend not to be really good friends too. To make something really, really perform tends to make it really, really, really fragile. And so they don't get along. So we can't max out anything by definition. And turns out the more you try to max, the more expensive it becomes and the longer it takes to build. So you want to be pretty judicious about when you say, we've got to really nail this down. So to solve that, I like to break it into 3 categories. My lead category, compete, and follow. The lead category says, okay, here are the areas of acceptance that for this particular consumer, we've got to be one of the best at, right? So for example, if I'm making a tennis shoe, if I'm trying to protect your feet, maybe it's the style. I got to be best at how stylistic it is, because that's what you're really judging the shoe on. Not how comfortable it is or how wonderful it is, but how stylistic it is, right? That's what it means to me. I've got to be the best at that particular one. The compete one says, you know, I don't have to be the best, but I got to be in the same ballpark as everyone else. And finally, so these are ones that says, I'm about par with them. So everyone else making shoes, I'm about the same thing as maybe at price point. I'm in the same price point as everyone else because that's where I'm willing to compete. And follow says, I'm willing to lag slightly behind the market because my particular consumer doesn't care about this one too much. They're pretty relaxed going, I don't worry about that. Let's say I'm buying a large luxury vehicle. Maybe I can follow as a manufacturer on maintainability of the vehicle, because for a large luxury vehicle, the typical consumer doesn't maintain it themselves. So if it's hard to maintain or slightly costly, that's not a big deal. I can follow on that. So if you think about these things, of how I sort these things out, a few are going to be in here. So I have a few acceptance criteria in the lead. I want to keep that down to like less than a half dozen or so. Most will be in the compete column. I'll be very similar to somebody else. And then again, a few down in the follow column, because that's what it means to say, okay, here's areas I can skip on to really devote resources and time to the things I want to lead in. So how does this look as a user story? Well, here's an example, back to my testing example. We can say, as an experienced tester, I want to enter a defect in the defect trace system so we can track a defect, right? The so that here isn't really adding a lot. I could probably have dropped, crossed that out, because it's not saying anything. It's basically saying the same thing over again. But I've got 3 example here areas. I got a lead area, I got to compete, and I've got to follow. We decided that for our product, we're going to really, really lead in ease of use. For the person entering the defect, that's what we're going to nail down. We're going to be really, really great at that. And we're just going to be just as reliable, have the same sort of uptime and that kind of stuff. We're going to be pretty happy with that. But our installation process, we think it's kind of a pain, because that's usually done by a specialist, and they're not the primary buyer. It's bought by the other part of the shop. They just have to install it. And so if that's not the easiest thing to install, we're okay there, right? So this is what we start seeing as a idea of how we create a user story. We got the description as an experienced tester I want to, and we got the acceptance criteria, but we're using it at the top level decision, the very big decision about what product I want to make. And we could actually use this to start making a roadmap of what we're going to build. So this is what I like to think about as a user story roadmap. And it goes from the things at the top of this page that I'm really, really confident about to the things at the bottom that I'm less confident about. So if I look at these columns of timing, the timing, I'm very confident that the timing is, we're doing things by quarters or by halves. Release numbers, I'm pretty comfortable what we're calling things. But confidence level, you can see that from here on out, I'm talking about the rest of these decisions, how confident I am that we're going to keep this decision or not. So for the first quarter, I'm really confident we're going to keep the decision. But by the second quarter, it's like 50-50 that we're still going to do what I'm thinking we're doing at this point. However, of that confidence, what I'm still pretty focused on is acceptance criteria, because that's what makes things different. The function we already said was kind of like, yeah, we're going to do that. right? We've always been doing that. I'm working with a client right now, and this is in the ultrasound space, and they're building a brand new machine. But their machine actually does the exact same functions as the previous machine, but it's going to do it faster, more reliably, more cost-effective to use it. So what's changing are the acceptance criteria, not the functions that do. Yeah, they might add another function there that didn't happen before, but the core functions, the reason people buy it, they're still doing the same thing, but they're changing the acceptance criteria. So I always want to lead with the acceptance criteria and who that consumer is for that acceptance criteria, right? Those are sort of paired up here. These two areas right here are really paired up, saying, for this consumer, here's what we're focusing on, the acceptance criteria. And then underneath that is the technology I think we're going to be using to drive that acceptance criteria. Here's the technology that allows us to get better on that area. Technology is always a driver of acceptance criteria. That's why we bring technology in. We don't do projects for technology's sake. We do it because it allows us to do some function for the customer better than we've ever done it before. And finally, at the bottom of my list, I see the likely features. And I say likely because we're willing to switch those up at a moment's notice in order to deliver on that acceptance criteria. If we come up with a better idea to make it more acceptable, or in this case, more usable or more accurate, we're going to do that instead. All right. And I just keep running this map going forward and keep it rolling a few quarters out so people can see exactly where we're trying to head and prioritize from the very top level what we should be working on. If it's not helping driving usability and accuracy for testers, why are we working on that in the first quarter? Help me sort my product backlog. And that's what top level stories are supposed to help me do, is help me prioritize and set direction. So that's my top level user story. Again, if you have questions or comments or things you want to share with me that you want me to address at the end of the session, stick them over in the comments or in the chat area, and we'll cover those when we get at the end here. So my middle level user stories, what are all of those about? Well, here's where we get to things that we might see a little more frequently and we're kind of used to. The kind of area I'm talking about here, as I said, as go in the middle here, are the value paths and value steps. And I'll define what those mean here in a second. But to give you a sense of these things, a value path, think about this as one way of accomplishing this, right? So say, that, for example, I want to check into a flight. What's one way I can check in? Well, I can check in on the web, or I can check in at a kiosk. The web and the kiosk are both value paths enabled by a technology bet of some kind. But really, from requirements decisions, I'm looking at value paths and then the steps within a particular path. So how can I possibly do this? Well, I'm going to have to break this down somehow. And as Melvin's going to show you in a session coming up after this one, if you want to do the impact mapping and story mapping, a great way to do that is something like a story map, where you say, okay, here's my function, enter a defect. As a tester, I want to enter a defect. And then I start thinking, what are the logical steps of entering defect? I might need to authenticate myself. Then I need to go in and enter the actual defect text. I needed to assign it to a particular area. I need to assign it to a particular area of origination. I need to assign it to a developer to work on. What are the steps that I have to do when I do this track a defect? Even if it was a manual process, these steps still make sense. I was just with a client, again, with the ultrasound, and I said, wow, you've just talked about these steps. Could I do those manually? They said, yeah, I guess you can. We used to do it with fields and stethoscopes, right? The function has the same basic logical steps. It doesn't have to be in the perfect order because the purpose of these steps is help me brainstorm underneath them. So what's the logical steps? And then I brainstorm on the steps of different ways of trying to accomplish that step. You know, here's one way I can do that step. Here's a different way I can do that step. Here's a piece of that step, right? And I call these, for lack of better terms, step stories, right? They're one way of doing that step, using technology one way or technology another way. My early example about checking airline, a step story would be check in or authenticate via kiosk. Another one could be authenticate via web browser. Another one could be authenticate via a phone app, right? So different ways I can accomplish that using probably different technologies. In fact, at this white level on your screen, the white sticky note level, those are really where technologists can come in and start saying, hey, we got an idea of how to do this. Or there might be an alternate story. An alternate story kind of says, well, here's something that's kind of related to this step, but not quite, but there's nowhere else to put it, so I'm going to put it down here. It's like, oh, here's something you do before you get into this step. An alternate way of doing this, right? So I got my alternate step, and then I might have another alternate story somewhere else. So I got all these different ways I can do it. All these step stories I can use to help try to figure out how to do this. But what I really need is I need to create an instance of enter a defect. I don't need an instance of all these things. I don't need to build all these things initially. I need to build at least one way to enter a defect. I need to figure out some path through these that allows me to get one instance of entering a defect. And that's my value path, right? That's what I think about of a value path. A value path is one way through all these things that delivers the value of entering a defect. It may not be the only pathway through this. I may have dozens of pathways through this, but each pathway can deliver the value of entering a defect at least one particular way. And for a fully functional product, I may need lots of value paths. My simplest value path might be what I call an MMF, a minimal marketable feature, or a minimal presentation feature. So I can get people using it and give me feedback. That works perfectly fine too, right? But a value path is sort of one pathway through this. And then I would select those stories and say, okay, we're going to work on these first because these help me deliver the functionality that ties back to that top level story of, as a tester, I want to enter a defect. So now I've used a user story format to drive me down one more level, right? And I can start saying, let me pause here for a second. What's really cool is that as I write these steps, the logical step of entering a defect, the first one might be authenticate myself. I may not have to write any new acceptance criteria because as long as I meet the acceptance criteria at the top, how I start out the bottom may not matter that much. And so I may only put acceptance criteria that are different than the overall one. For example, if I say less than 2 minutes to enter a defect, I can't take 2 minutes on authenticating myself because I won't have any time for the rest of the steps. So I may decide on this step story for authenticating myself, I'm only going to give myself 15 seconds because I need to be able to get this done in 2 minutes or less. So we take those stories and then and when they form the top of my product backlog, right? Because that's the most valuable thing to work on, the first thing I want to get out the door. So those are my first stories. And now we got to look at them and ask the age-old question, do they fit, right? Because if they fit in a sprint, then I can finish doing the work to get them ready. But if they don't fit, I've got to break them down some more. I've got to break them apart into smaller and smaller stories. And how do I kind of do that? Well, I've got my story here, and I have to look at it and say, is it going to fit? And I can break it down by workflow. I can take the step story and break it into smaller steps, or there might be 2 or 3 different kinds of ways to approach that step story, so I could break it down by type. But I always have to say, will it fit in a particular sprint? And once I decide it fits, then it's okay. I've got my middle level story, and I'm looking pretty good right now. And once I get that, I can turn them and do the rest of the check to say, is this actually ready, right? Is this a ready level story? And then you can come with your own list of things. And the first one should always be, does it fit? Does it actually fit in my sprint length? And this means that the team itself has high confidence we can deliver this in one sprint, right? Are all the acceptance criteria complete? Because if the acceptance criteria are complete, that means it's ready for us to work on. And we have to actually understand and say, yes, we can deliver that acceptance criteria level in this sprint. It should be sized. Obviously, it's fit. But now we're sizing because sizing in Agile is really about having a conversation about the design. And so sizing is a backdoor way of saying, do we think we're designing it the same way? And then any dependencies resolved. I think about dependencies in 2 areas. Technical dependencies. Do we have a clue about how to build this? And resource dependencies. Do we need other teams or other people to come in and help build part of this? Again, I want all of those resolved. Resolved here also meaning I don't have to have them done, but I have to have confidence they will be done by the end of the sprint, right? So they're really not a dependency anymore. So that is my middle layer stories here. Taking them from the top layer, doing some decomposition, still keeping the functionality, but now they're step stories rather than the overall function wanted. And then I brought down acceptance criteria only when I have deltas from that top level one. That's my middle level. So again, comments or questions, you can throw them in the chat box. Whoops, one more I didn't see down here. A team has high confidence. The idea there being we have high confidence that we can actually build this thing. All right. So how does this then work at the bottom level of my stories? right? So we've got the story coming in, and this sounds like the kind of story right now we're at that we typically pull into a sprint, right? We pull in that story, we work it. Is there a level below that? Is there a bottom level user story? Well, what we're talking about at the decision level here is down at the sort of the preferences level. Yeah, it's not going to make a killer one way or another, but they would prefer it this way, or they tend to work that way. And if you did it, they'd be much happier than if you did it some other way. If they're really into blue, let's try to use blues. Let's try not to use reds or greens because they like blue, right? What are the preferences down here? So where do we capture those in our user story world? Well, we're going to capture those primarily in sprint planning and its follow-on in the daily stand-ups or daily scrums. Because we've taken in that ready story, right? That story that's okay, ready to go. And we're going to say, hey, product owner, have us and tell us about this, right? We're going to have them share the context in a conversation with us, because that's where we get the bottom level story. Because the story here is, you got to think about it as an actual story, a story that one human being tells to other human beings, a storyteller. And that's what the product owner has to act as in the sprint planning meeting. They are our storyteller. They're telling us all this detail about where they are and what they're doing and how many fingers are on their hands and all this kind of stuff. They have to tell the story to the rest of the team. And every time they touch the card, they're going to tell that story again. I kind of joke to a lot of my Scrum teams that the product owner, you're going to start hearing them sound like your old grandfather, the senile one who keeps telling you the same stories over and over again. Remember, son, did I tell you about the time I caught that large fish? Yeah, Grandpa, you told me 35 times. Well, it was a big one. And off they go again, right? That's how the product owner starts to sort of interact with the team, because here's the story card. We're going to be touching it multiple times in its life. We touch it as it starts going into the top of the pile, as it forms a value path that we want to work on. We touch it as we refine it and get into a ready state. We touch it as we pull it into sprint planning at this point and say, yes, let me tell you the story one more time again. So the user story here is bigger than the physical card. It's bigger than the Jira data entry. It's that context that's conveyed by the product owner as well. And then we can then drive it to the done criteria, right? Because we have the preferences, we can make sure that we check not only that we meet the acceptance criteria of the consumer, but we meet the acceptance criteria of the team. All this stuff down here is more the acceptance criteria of the team that says what it means to be done with a story. Here's the team protecting its interest about having maintainable software that we can use and work on over and over and over again. And so not only have the acceptance criteria from the consumer on top, but we have the acceptance criteria of the team to say, what does it mean we have good code that we're happy to work on again? So let's start trying to wrap this up a little bit here so we have lots of time for questions and comments. So how does this actually look? Again, how does the top bottom actually work? I'm going to use my little map here to help guide about where I think we're talking about when we talk about requirements decisions, from the very top decisions to the bottom decisions. The top decisions are in the product vision. Requirements decisions in the green, the technology bets in the blue. For those that are colorblind, top requirements, bottom design. Both of those I like to put in a thing I call the product vision. The product vision is basically a statement saying, here's why we're building it, here's our top consumers, and here's when we do this thing for them, what makes that acceptable. I was just with a client, I've been working with a client just recently, and we're going through and building their product vision about what their product is. And they're saying, well, yeah, the functions sound like our existing product. I say, yes, but it's all about the acceptance criteria. That's what makes it different. You're getting more aggressive, or you're having to introduce new technology to stay where you were because that old technology has sort of become commodity and it's now everyone's doing that. Then we go into a release scope of some kind. This is where the value paths, what's in this particular release? What are we going to build for this next 3-month period or 6-month period that someone can go out and actually use? Working with another client, and this was really powerful for them because they could start showing their being very specific about what their consumers could do at each release because they based it upon value paths, not about just adding features. Because when they were doing features, they say, yeah, we got all these features, but what do we actually give to somebody? They didn't know. In fact, I had another client that was going around looking at all their feature teams saying, what can we ship? What's shippable? They're like, well, we're mostly done with this feature. But when we start switching them to value paths, they're saying, oh, I only need to build this much of this particular feature in order to support that value path. We can ship that in a few months, right? So we got a better sense of this release scope by focusing on value paths. Then once we got a value path, I like to think about the next thing that captures all these steps, the feature spec, because here we're going to put in a lot of content, details, potentially about how we're going to build it, but more it's going to be more about methods and structures and just sort of workflow diagrams part of the feature spec. And finally, the sprint planning itself. The sprint planning where we don't even have a document anymore. Before, we could have a physical document if we so chose. We don't have to, but we could. But by the time we get to sprint planning, it's all about the conversations, having that community. Now, I do have clients that want to capture that and still in a physical document. And I think you can do that. I just say, call these pictorial diagrams or something like that. Make them a supplement. Don't make them a formal requirement that you want to trace or test against. Make them something supplemental because they're all about preferences at this point, at the bottom of our overall stack. So given all that, we're making all these decisions from top to bottom using the user story format. So that's my idea of using user stories from top to bottom. If you have any questions, this is a great time to ask them. And if you have comments too, I'll be happy to look at those. Just throw them in the chat box on the side. One question. So one question is, Earl, what about traceability? Can user stories be used for traceability? And I say the answer is certainly they can. Remember, the user story is both the function and the acceptance criteria. You just have to have a numbering system. That's where that name comes in really handy on top. That verb noun name comes in handy. Just give that a tag of some kind, whether you want to use the verb noun name as the tag itself, or you want to put a numbering system. I was just working with a client who has severe traceability needs. They're an FDA regulated group, and we've got their product vision, their top level requirements, the ones they're actually going to do validation from. We took them from like 200 statements down to about 25, or I think it turned out to be about 50 statements, from several hundred down to 50. That's going to make their life a heck of a lot easier than they had ever had before. So that was a great question. Yes, it works fine for traceability, but trace to the problem, not the solution. That's the difference between, I think, between validation and verification. Validation, did you solve the right problem? Verification, did we build it like we said we're going to build it? So that's a great question. Any other questions out there? Okay. Oh yeah, here it looks like there's one coming in. Whose job is it to write these different level ones? That's a great question. The top level questions, even though we're using the user story format, that's really not the province of the product owner to make that decision typically all by themselves. This is a bet the business kind of question at the top level of the stack. As you go down the stack, then we're going to have different roles. But the top level, this is where your product overall VP of product management, maybe a C-level suite if you're a smaller company, really have to make that decision. We can still capture it in user story format, but that's who's going to make the decision. When we get to the middle level, this is where the product owner, either by themselves or working with a product manager, can make those kind of decisions. And then we'll also want to start bringing in the team to start saying, are these decisions where you're setting the acceptance criteria at a reasonable level or not? Are they doable at that level? And then as we drive it down a little bit more, then that becomes just mostly the team making those decisions. So that's a great question. All right. Okay, well, it looks like those are the just two main questions we had. So I want to thank you for spending some time with me talking about user stories top to bottom. You see my email address if you want to have an offline chat of your own or just chit chat. I'll be happy to do that as well. But want to recommend that you come back for the next session. I know that Melvin is doing a great one on user story impact mapping, user story mapping, so you can check that out as well. So thank you very much for attending.